As a father of a daughter and 2 sons, I look out with some trepidation at the world of relationships into which they are, of necessity, emerging. An important new book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry, makes the case, I would say, that generations of women who grew up during and after the heady days of the 1960s have quite simply been let down. Rather than being set free by the revolution, women may have taken one way of putting their needs second to those of men and done little more than swap it for another. Louise Perry joins me now. Good evening.
Good evening. Hello.
Is that fair to say?
Yes, I would say that's a very nice summary.
I read your book all in one go. I read it all in one bite. I was especially struck by a line that we are seeing between many young men and women, a tragedy of mutual incomprehension. And that really resonated with me. I wonder if you could just develop that thought a little.
Yes. I've had a few people say they read it all in one go, interestingly. I don't know if it's quite short, so maybe it's a nice, convenient, bite-sized read. Yeah, so the tragedy of mutual miscomprehension. The argument I make, basically, is that there are some really important sexual asymmetries between men and women, right? So some of them are physical. Only women can get pregnant. Men are significantly stronger and bigger than women are on average. That sort of thing. Some of them are also psychological, which is a bit more difficult to say because that's a more controversial claim often. But we know from reams of decades of research data that there are some important average psychological differences between the sexes, including in terms of sexuality. So we know, for instance, that men like casual sex more than women do on average, which is not to say that all men do and all, whatever, but on average, that's quite a marked difference. And it's the sort of thing that you see at the population level. And the argument that I'm making in the book is that given that it is not an even playing field, given that there are these important asymmetries that make women more vulnerable in certain ways, mean that women bear the consequences of sexual encounters in ways that men don't, and also given that men are more likely to enjoy some of the things that have become more socially acceptable post-sexual revolutions, things like casual sex and porn and buying sex and all that kind of stuff, which is presented sometimes as freedom. My argument is actually that oftentimes that comes at women's expense. And I think that to frame that historical change as solely to women's benefit, which is not to say there haven't been some benefits to women, is a mistake. And actually, in general, to see any kind of massive historical event like the sexual revolution as being all a good thing or all a bad thing, is, I think, a really foolish way of looking at history.
I'm asking for a generalisation, I know, but would you say that the younger generation, I suppose I mean by that, I don't know, maybe women from, under 35, I suppose, is that generation now in a better place than the generation that immediately preceded the much vaunted sexual revolution? Or have they just swapped one unhappy place for another?
So they're better in some ways. I mean, my generation are, for instance, better educated. They're earning more, and in the workplace and in education, they're doing better, often doing better than men, actually, right up until they have children. But that's another story. In terms of sexuality, I'm not sure that they are, because actually, what we've seen, particularly since the turn of the century and the advent of online porn, is this intense, pornification of sexual culture, which I think actually has been really damaging to a lot of women and a lot of young men as well. I think that porn is such a malevolent product because it's not just that it's produced in a really unethical way, but actually the effect that it has on young minds is just appalling. And I think that what we're doing in a way is we're running this unplanned experiment on the world's children, because we know that kids are now seeing porn at the age of sort of 11, 12, sometimes younger. They're watching potentially hundreds of hours of porn before they've even had any sexual relationships in real life. So they're coming to real relationships with all of these sort of images embedded in their minds, and we know that this has an effect in all sorts of really troubling ways.
Emma Webb, an unplanned experiment. Would you concur, agree that something unintended is unfolding before our eyes?
I think, as with all revolutions, anything that the word revolution gets to describe, you end up with unintended consequences, and many of them are, usually quite awful. And so much of what you say rings true, and I'm actually, like Neil, going to be downloading your book onto Kindle this evening to read it, because so much of what you say, I think it rings true with my experience as somebody of the same generation. And I think, for me, something that I'm really interested in is the consequences of contraception, particularly hormonal contraception, on society at large, because that is a huge cultural shift that has such profound effects. And if we're talking about the unintended consequences, historically, the unintended consequences of that change to people's lives and the fact that we're having children much later, actually polls suggest that there's a huge amount of dissatisfaction amongst women when it comes to when they're having children and so on. So for me, that is something that, you know, I think even the quote that you used at the beginning there about the mutual incomprehension, I think that there are really deep unintended consequences of the sexual revolution, and I'm so glad that somebody has investigated it more.
Emma Burnell, are we unlearning how to be together?
I think there is an element of that, but there's also, I guess, more options, and for some of us, and for a while now, that's definitely included me. I went down the traditional route. I got married. I didn't have children, but I did the monogamous thing. And he started off with another woman, and then I found my fun. I'm going to just say I have a lot of casual sex. Some of it's great, some of it's terrible. All of it's my choice. And that has suited me. There'll be a time when I want to settle down and meet someone nice, and then I will stop having lots of casual sex. And there may be that I've closed off options because there are some men who wouldn't want to have a relationship with a woman who's had a lot of sexual partners. They wouldn't be the right guy for me. The point, I think, and I think Louise raises some really very good points, and I think part of the issue is that I sit between the generation of my mother, who was at the forefront of the sexual revolution, and your generation of women in their 30s. I'm exactly between the two. I'm Generation X, where we kind of, in some ways, we didn't have the pornification issue. There was porn, but it was on VHS. It was considerably, or you found it in a bush, bizarrely. No one ever knew why that happened, but it did.
With people hanging around.
But it's a really well-known phenomenon. I don't know why, but we're getting sidetracked. But so I think we were discovering the effects of the sexual revolution, both positive and negative, but together as boys and girls who were finally seeing each other as equals, I guess. And that seems to have gone away in many ways, and we've gone back to these awful situations which are deeply unfeminist. So I don't think there's a feminist yes, no, should you or should you not behave in a freely sexual manner. I don't think it's about telling other women what to do or not do with their bodies and their partners and what have you, and I don't think that's what you're doing. I think the sexual revolution, when it came in a time when we were deeply misogynistic as a society, and I think in many ways some of that was embedded in that. So I think it's an unfinished revolution at best.
So, Louise, I think if I'm right in my reading of your book, I think you would say that misogynist element is still very much still there. And you paint a very bleak picture of, I think, what you call hookup culture, and you say that it really, it's another means by which men used to get things the way they wanted them in the world before the 1960s, and lo and behold now men have just found another way to get the things that they want the way they want them, but they've got the compliance of generations of women. Is that fair to say?
I'd say that it's a subset of men. So I wouldn't say that this has been of benefit to all men necessarily, because actually there are lots of young men who are struggling to find any partners whatsoever, and we've got this funny kind of paradox where on that one hand we've got an incredibly hypersexual sort of public life, more so than possibly any time in history, but on the other hand we've actually got people having less sex than they used to,
which is a bizarre paradox.
It is odd, isn't it? But I think it sort of makes sense actually to the extent that what we're seeing is a sort of people being channeled by the culture, because this is what I mean about, thinking about this in terms of cultures and networks, and thinking about the thing I get frustrated about sometimes in just talking about sex on the individual level and just talking about choice and just is that we are enmeshed with one another. You know, this is the nature of living in a society. Everybody's decisions affect everybody else. And so this idea that we can make a completely free choice, I'm sceptical of. And I think that the problem that we're seeing is we used to have a culture where there was huge pressure put on young women in particular to not have sex before marriage, and, you know, that was really restrictive on those young women. But I think we've got the same thing. It's just flipped, you know. And you speak to young women now, and they feel as if casual sex is compulsory. It's the thing that you have to go through if you want to get to a monogamous relationship, which actually most women say is what they ultimately want.
At the end of the book, you write very movingly about testimony from a girl, Abby, and how she was in touch, saying that she had started looking at and talking to pictures of herself as a child, and you interpret it as her mothering herself.
Yeah.
Treating her younger self, talking to her younger self as though she was that younger person's mother.
Yes.
And I found that really poignant, as though the revolution has also in some way compromised the bonds between the older generation, the wiser generation born of years.
Yeah.
That's been hauled below the waterline.
And I think that's something that's baked into the idea of progress. You know, I don't call myself a progressive, even though I might agree with some progressives on some things, and even though I work for The New Statesman, which many people consider to be a progressive magazine. I don't like that word because I think that what it suggests is that history is linear and everything just gets better all the time, which it patently doesn't. And I think that one of the problems with viewing it in that way, and particularly the way that feminism is often framed as waves, and sort of each wave gets wiser and has greater insight or whatever, is that it cuts generations off from each other, and it means that young women today, for instance, are kind of primed by that ideology to reject what their mums have to say and to reject what their grandmothers have to say because
So it's
whatever
almost a
this
rite
is
of
in the
passage
past.
that you have to reject what your mother told
Yeah,
you.
and everything new must necessarily be better than what's old, and you know, and like. The conservative counterpart to that is to think everything old must be better than everything that's new, right? And I think both narratives are really simplistic and actually really misleading if that's how you're basing your decision-making. Because, I think that young women have so much to learn from their mums' generations, because these are the women who've lived it.
You do speak very strongly in favour of marriage, though. I feel it would be remiss of me not to...
That's the controversial chapter, yes.
That you're very strong.
I can give you the flip side on divorce if you like.
You're very strongly of the opinion that that's the lifeboat, that's the safe place.
So I have a chapter where I argue against the very common feminist argument that marriage is necessarily oppressive to women. I think that if what we think of marriage as being is basically just a legal bond between parents and children, you know, thinking of it in terms of what its kind of original function, which is about childbearing, and it is about cementing the responsibilities that the family unit have to one another and protecting the vulnerability, the inherent profound vulnerability of the mother and child early in life. If we think of marriage in those terms rather than as this kind of patriarchal, system of traditions and whatever, then I think actually it is a mistake to think that doing away with that is going to protect women. I think actually the nature of having children, I say this as a mother of a 1-year-old, is that it makes you really vulnerable and it makes it really difficult for you to participate in the labour market and do all the stuff that you have to in a modern society. And actually crucially, making it so that dads have obligations to the mothers of their children and to their children, I don't think that we can just throw that away.
Louise Perry, I could talk to you for hours about this, or I could listen to you talk about this for hours.
I almost want to clap.
I have to thank you for that, and
Thank you so
we'll
much.
definitely come back to this subject.